me? And hello. Okay. Um, we will likely go the full time this evening. So thanks everyone for your time and those of y'all joining us in person. Um, we'll just kick off with welcome and attendance, and we push the meeting minutes to the end. Um, I will call roll. Commissioner Montgomery is expected but not here yet. Commissioner McCullough is not here. Commissioner Shotkin? Here. Commissioner Smith? Here. Commissioner Dansby? Here. Commissioner Evans here. Commissioner Ortiz will not be joining us this evening. And we have Mami Ibrahim and Ethan Trin from the Office of the Independent Policing Auditor. We will go ahead and get started. Let's switch over to the slides. In the chat, I see someone saying that they're having trouble hearing you all. I can hear you all. It is a little bit lower in volume than what I feel like it normally is. But I'm not sure. I'm not necessarily used to attending virtually, so I'm not necessarily sure I have the best foundation for what it's supposed to sound like. But if there's a way to turn up the volume of the microphone in the room on the panel, that might be helpful.
We'll just try to keep our voices up.
Yeah, we will try to enunciate. So we have Anika. Thank you for joining us. We have members of ACPD with us and a member of the public, several members online. Thank you again. We'll just preview the agenda on the next slide in a minute. We're going to open with an acknowledgement of a public petition circulating around the death of Sean Vaughn. We're going to go through a case investigation review. That's a concurrent administrative investigation conducted by the Office of the Independent Policing Auditor and ACPD's Office of Professional Responsibility. We'll have time for public comment before we go through our normal admin of chair updates, IPA updates, and meeting minutes, and then the COB will have open discussion. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. The first thing on our agenda this morning is the death of Sean Vaughn. Sean died prematurely on May 8th at 33 years old when Arlington County police officers shot and killed him. Sean was a familiar face around Columbia Pike, and many who knew him held a vigil to mourn Sean's death. He was a member of our community, and we'd like to observe a moment of silence to honor Sean's life. Thank you. For members of the public joining us online this evening, we want to be clear that the COB and IPA cannot prejudge the investigation findings, but whatever the critical incident response team investigation concludes, a man was killed in Arlington County, and the people who knew him have waited more than 100 days. There's a public petition circulating to request more transparency from ACPD, and it strikes me that the petition is not about impatience, but an expression of grief with nowhere to go. The COB has not seen this footage, and we cannot characterize what it will show, but we believe that transparency and due process are not conflicting values. As the public body charged with increasing trust between the community and our law enforcement officials, the COB exists on the premise that transparency and accountability strengthen public safety. We will go forward and review. Can you advance the slide?
Yep.
So currently there's an active criminal investigation. This is led by the Critical Incident Response Team in Northern Virginia. This investigation will conclude in a report to the Commonwealth Attorney, who will then decide whether or not to pursue criminal charges based on the investigation findings against involved officers. That portion of the proceeding doesn't have a set timeline and is being led by, actually, I'm not sure which law enforcement agencies are leading it, but the compact governing the Northern Virginia CERT agreement is that it creates an independent mechanism for neighboring Virginia-based law enforcement to conduct a criminal investigation. Once that concludes, the Office of the Independent Police Monitor, or IPA, and ACPD, Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, will conduct a concurrent administrative investigation. That's where they will look at the shooting to determine whether officers' conduct was within policy. So the distinction here is that CERT conducts the criminal investigation. The Commonwealth Attorney decides whether or not to proceed with charges based on those findings. And then after that investigation concludes, both the OIPA and Office of Professional Responsibility specifically review based on existing policy. After those two reports are available from their concurrent investigation, the COB will review that investigation findings in public meeting. Go ahead, Ethan. So the current national landscape for critical incident disclosure policies is expanding very quickly. It's not terribly visible on the slide. That's a map of the US, but there are at least 22 agencies that have implemented relevant policies. You have several that have a response timeline of 72 hours to 10 business days, another handful with 14 to 30 days governing the release of relevant information. Chicago and LA have a policy of 45 to 60 days, and then the last ones are governed by state law backstops, specified as expeditiously as possible. Knoxville has a goal associated with that. But right now, our current policy gap, which preceded the incident, is sort of lagging in national best practice. So if we go forward, Ethan, moving forward, we looked at kind of relevant Virginia law. We do not have similar backstops precluding the release of the public release of ongoing investigation files or openness with the public. Recently, the Arlington County Board directed the county manager and ACPD to collaborate with the OIPA to implement a new body-worn camera disclosure policy. So we will certainly keep those conversations active in our public meetings. But we have neighbors in Fairfax and Alexandria who have implemented this. Fairfax is part of our CERT compact. DC was challenged. No, oh, they're not. DC was challenged on their policy in court. The courts found that there is not standing for officer privacy based on actions taken during active duty. So for kind of our portion of reviewing these cases, that's how the proceedings will take place with the subsequent investigations, and then our public review. Until then, this is what we're able to discuss, but we're very supportive of the public desire to have more transparency around this case. They'll have to develop it. So that's just recently the Arlington County Board directed, presumably the MOU stakeholders, to collaborate on the development of a policy. And there are lots of different facets of when it gets released, what's released, the kind of timeline of notifying different parties. There's a lot that will need to go into that. But there is a large body of established policies to draw from best practice. Not all of those communities are similar to Arlington County, but there is certainly a basis of national best practice to draw from. Yeah. So with that, I think we'll move forward into the investigation review. Oh, Mummy?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly add on that it's my understanding that once we have put together a draft policy that regarding releasing body-worn camera footage during critical incidents, it will be put before the county board, and we'll also have an opportunity for public review and public comments. I just want people to know that there will be some transparency around the policy that we end up with, and an opportunity for folks in the community to weigh in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that we had lots of participation in our 5-year anniversary reception recently and new members to our listserv. So if you go to the COB website, you can sign up for updates. As we go through that, we'll circulate opportunities for public comment and any draft materials for review. Okay, I will turn it over to Dave and Selena, who were the co-leads for our investigation review of case 25 CMP 057. This was a complaint filed on behalf of a deaf driver
I don't know.
in the face by an officer during a traffic stop after rolling through a stop sign at 4 a.m. His tags were turned with an indication of a suspended driver's license. Selena?
We make the slides any bigger or is that big?
You can use these.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Lena, it's hard to hear you from wherever you're sitting in the room.
It's
Sorry.
where to
Maybe by even.
Where Julie is sitting is clear. So I don't know if it's possible for you all to switch seats for the time being, or for you to move a little closer. I'm not exactly sure where the microphone is in that room, but I can say her audio is louder.
Sure. Is this better?
A little bit.
Okay. It's hard to know where the microphone is. I will just say.
This is not our normal room.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's a little better, I think.
Okay. I'll try to speak up. And
Thank
if you can't
you.
hear me, just raise your hand or something.
Thank you so much.
So there's a lot of facts in this case, and there was a lot of evidence, and we tried to summarize it as briefly as we could, but we may have left out a few details. But we thought these were the most relevant facts of the case, which is that Officer 1 saw the complainant sitting in a car in a cul-de-sac in a residential area, and it was around 4 o'clock in the morning. And when she saw him, he started moving slowly away when the complainant saw the marked police car. So she followed the complainant's car. She saw him rolling through a stop sign. She activated her lights and her siren behind his car, and she ran his plates and learned that his license was suspended and that he had an Alexandria, Virginia address. He drove most of his time quite slowly, or the appropriate speed, but he did not pull over. And then he rolled through a second stop sign while the officer was right behind him. She thought he might have been driving while impaired. He stopped at a red light, and the officer parks right behind him. She gets out and she walks up to the complainant's car, and she raps on the roof of his car, and she definitely approaches pretty quickly. She's determined when she does this, and within 3 seconds, she tries to open the driver's side door, which is locked, and she's saying, "You need to stop the car." Next slide. He puts his hands up right away and he points to his ears, which is indicating clearly that he's hearing impaired. And the officer 1 said in her interview that she believed she needed to get him out of the car immediately because she was worried about that he was DUI, driving under the influence. And she said that she recognized within 3 to 5 seconds that he was hearing impaired, but his deafness made no difference to the way that she approached him, because she was very focused on the public safety and the threat that he was posing, potentially driving impaired. So she repeatedly tells him, put the car in park, roll the window down. And during this time, he's making some noises, but he's not complying. But when she points to, so first she points to the window, and he does roll the window down about 10 seconds after she pulls on his door handle. And when she's pointing to what she wants done, he tends to comply. His words tend to be stop and no, and they definitely sound like someone who's hearing impaired. Once the window's open, Officer 1 immediately reaches into the car twice, and she repeats, put the car in park. And he seems to be saying what? Once he understands what the officer wants, he puts the car in park. And this is 11 seconds after he opened the window. Next slide. With the car in park, Officer 1 repeatedly tells the complainant to turn the car off, but he doesn't seem to understand her. Officer 1 immediately reaches back into the car, and he's pushing her hand away. Officer 1 yells, stop. He does seem throughout this time that he's terrified. He really, really looks scared. He has his hands up like he's trying to surrender. She said, Officer 1 stated in her interview that the complainant pulled her hand into the car. It wasn't so clear to us if that's what was happening or, you know, what exactly was occurring. He might have been trying to stop Officer One from opening his car door. And during this struggle, Officer One punched him in the face at least once. It may have been 2 or 3 times, but it's hard to see. Officer One does end up with some scratches on her arm and her lip. And then a backup arrives for Officer One 1 minute and 12 seconds from the time she arrived at the car. And 21 seconds after that, the complainant is removed from the car. While he's handcuffed and he's sitting on the curb, Officer One is typing several text messages for the complainant to read. At one point, Officer One was prepared to allow the complainant to be taken out of the handcuffs to type a text response. Next slide. When the officers helped the complainant up from the curb, they were going to try to remove the handcuffs, but they thought he was moving around in a way that was unsecure, so they did not remove the handcuffs, and the complainant was put back on the curb. Officer One says, it appears that she heard him say, "fuck you" to her, although we did not necessarily hear that from the body-worn camera footage. But believing that he had said that while he was sitting on the curb, and Officer One thought that he was complaining about her conduct, so Officer One told the complainant, "Yeah, I punched you square in the fucking face. Absolutely, I did hit you. Yeah, because you were grabbing my arm a lot, and I said let go." Officer One's supervisor did not conduct a use of force review of Officer One's conduct as required, and later ACPD undertook a use of force review and found that Officer One's conduct was within policy. ACPD sustained a violation of policy against the supervisor for his failure to conduct a use of force review of Officer One's conduct, and the supervisor received a punch. Dave, is there anything you want to add to these facts?
No, I think when we discuss them, anybody can weigh in with additional facts that they recall, that they find important.
Can I just add that when the second officer arrived at the door while this physical struggle was going on, the second officer on the scene said, "Is he deaf?"
He did.
And she said, "I don't know." And he said, "He's saying he's deaf." And Officer One, who punched him in the face, said, "That's fine, get him out of the car because he's just not listening."
So ACPD reviewed Officer One violation of personal contacts and duty responsibility. So we looked at both those policies and for use of force as well, which was ultimately also something that ACPD reviewed. So looking first at the personal contacts policy, the text of the policy is on the left, and it's clear that the policy says employees are expected to treat all persons with respect and not creating profane or abusive language. And obviously during the interaction, Officer One said, "Absolutely, I punched you square in the fucking face." I think that more than just Selena and I recommend that like ACPD, be a violation of the policy. From a little larger perspective, I mean, I think overall, Officer One's conduct was less than respectful. I mean, just as a Arlington citizen, I mean, I do feel I understand. Sort of wrapping a number of these together, we'll go back and separate them out. But it's a general summary. I understand that Officer One was concerned about public safety, but she did not read what was happening in front of her. And as a citizen, it was very disappointing. I find it very disappointing. She failed to recognize that the individual in the car was clearly deaf, was clearly terrified, and her insistence that he be pulled out of the car led to, I think, her physical interaction with him, which I don't think needed to happen. So sort of backing it up, on personal contacts, that was an easy one for Selena and I to find a recommendation, and we'll vote on this because of the language at a minimum. I also also think generally that her interaction was less than respectful, and we can sort of unpack that a little bit, because I think it came from her insistence that he be removed from the car, and there is a degree of tactical police judgment involved in that. But so anyway, so let's go to the next one. We'll vote after we sort of walk through all of these. So this is just a quick notice that there is a policy that ACPD has that discusses explicitly officer requirements to interact and how they're supposed to interact with people who are visually or hearing impaired. And it says that they will take, quote, all reasonable steps to accommodate suspects that are deaf. So let's jump to the next slide, which is the duty and responsibilities. So the way Selena and I looked at that is that 523 policy is essentially incorporated into Officer 1's duty and responsibility. That is a freestanding policy, and it's one that we found that she did not meet. Duty responsibilities requires an officer to take, quote, proper police action. And we believe that that included accommodating this suspect's hearing disability. I understand, and I think we understand, that this is something in Officer 1's mind that is compared with or sort of balanced against her interest in public safety. And again, in my estimation, it was a balance that she completely misjudged. I think if she had looked at what she was facing and realized that he was deaf, she would not have immediately, taken the steps that she did. The thing that really struck me, just to jump to it, is within 3 seconds, she pulled his car door open. I don't understand that, and I think that's worth some discussion, when we have a forward discussion. But to me, what had happened up to that point was, and I think we tried to lay out the facts leading up to this as fully as possible. She saw an individual in a darkened cul-de-sac. It's 4 a.m. She also said, and actually we didn't put this, she did say to her supervisor that at some point in the past there had been a child abduction in that area, but we don't know when or what connection that has. Either way, he started to drive, and I think he said he was sleeping in his car. So, I mean, there's a number of possibilities when an officer drives up to somebody sitting in a car in a dark alley, it's 4 a.m. What do you make of that? And I think it's fair to say, okay, we don't know. That could be a number of situations. It could, as the individual here said, that he was sleeping in his car. Maybe he's not. Maybe he doesn't have a home. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's more nefarious. Maybe he's associated with a child abduction. We don't know. So I get that that's a point that we need to sort of step back and say, okay, anything could have been the case at that point. What actually happened was he drives off, he rolls through a couple of stop signs. He's not racing 80, 90 miles an hour. He's going the speed limit. But he clearly rolls through stop signs with the officer right behind him. So something's going on. And then he doesn't actually ever pull over. He comes to a stop, a red light, and she pulls up behind him. Now I'm sort of veering wildly, but I mean, again, this is a tactical thing, and I think it might have been better if she pulled in front of him, so he couldn't have pulled off, but she doesn't. She stops behind him, but immediately she tries to open his car door, like right away. I don't understand that. To me, if I'm, without communicating, like, I just don't understand why a police officer has to open your car door before they've said anything to you. And I think his reaction is, whoa, what is going on here? Should he, and let's assume that he clearly is deaf, so maybe he didn't hear the siren. He probably should have seen the light. He didn't pull over. We don't know why. Maybe there's a mental health issue. We don't know. But either way, he realizes she's trying to get into my car. And his reaction is not one that I'm surprised by. He's like, whoa, wait a minute.
Well,
yeah.
One thing to note is in the Blue Envelope program, which is a statewide program that acknowledges that drivers who either have autism or other communication challenges are often startled or challenged by flashing lights, and that it requires longer communication periods for them to understand and comply with orders. That's also part of established policy.
And we don't know his mental condition, whether he is or isn't autistic, but there is a statewide policy that acknowledges that people who have that difficulty, can have a blue envelope. They're supposed to, I mean, that wasn't what happened here, although it was raised by one of the officers who said, is this a blue envelope situation? Anyway, his reaction is not that surprising to me. I mean, he's freaked out, he's terrified, and yet, within 10 seconds, he does what she says. He lowers his window. And then within another...
When she points.
Yeah, when she points. And then when she sort of like put it in park, he's like, he puts it in park. So he complies. And then she reaches into his car to open the door. And he's like, no, 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 no. He is freaked out. And, you know, at the point where that she says he's pulling her arm into the car, it's hard to tell. It looks to me like he's just trying to stop her. If let's say he is pulling his arm into her, I think my sense is, look, at a point where an officer, whether it's the officer's fault or not, gets into a situation where the officer is in physical danger, they have a right to pull their arm back. They have a right to defend themselves. So I'm a little ahead of myself, but just to go back to the duty responsibilities, we recommend that it's a violation because, we recommend that it's a violation because we don't believe that Officer 1 accommodated his hearing disability. She literally said, as Julie referenced, when backup came, get him out of the car, he wasn't listening. And yet in her interview, she said within 3 to 5 seconds, she thought he was deaf. I mean, and maybe she wasn't 100% sure, but that's the point. It's like she didn't take the time. She was so ramped up on getting him out of the car, getting him out of the car. And just as a citizen, I don't think that was what should have happened, and was really disappointed in that. I mean, I get her public safety interest, but this guy got punched in the face, and that's just anyway. We recommend a violation of duty responsibilities for failure to meet essentially 523. And then let's go to the next one, because then we also looked at use of force. And so use of force has, as part of its initial policy, a requirement that before using force, whenever possible, and when such delay will not compromise the safety of the officer or another and will not result in the destruction of evidence, escape of suspect, or commission of crime, an officer shall allow an individual time and opportunity to submit to verbal commands before force is used. So again, it is a judgment call. Is it, escape, or, her concern was he was going to like drive off and hit somebody in a DUI. And our view is that by failing to essentially accommodate him with his disability or stop and just take a moment, she didn't de-escalate, essentially because she didn't take the time to allow him to submit to verbal commands. She saw his reaction as resistance, and she said that several times during the interview, that like he kept resisting. And when we reviewed it, and yeah, it's in hindsight, but when we reviewed it, it didn't look like he was resisting. It looked like he was scared to death. And we want officers to be able to take the time to see what's actually happening in front of them. And so we did recommend that the use of force be a violation as well. And I will.
Can we go one more down? Less lethal force.
Yeah. So the second half of the de-escalation policy is, if you're in a situation where force is used, you should try to use, the least amount of force. And here, at least my reason, and we've discussed this, but my own personal reason for thinking that the use of force policy was violated, it rests on her failure to allow him to submit to verbal commands, and less, or for me, not so much on the fact that she punched him, ironically. I mean, I think she put herself in a position to have to do that, which was wrong. But I know legally there's a distinction between the moment of threat and what leads up to it. And I'm looking at the larger circumstances. Like at the moment where, if in fact he's pulling her hand in, I think that's kind of, she put herself in that position, but I still believe that she has the need and the right to extract her hand. And others may see it differently, but I feel like, okay, maybe one punch was necessary to do that. But again, recommending that use of force be a violation because of the failure to accommodate him that got her in that position in the first place. I don't think she could have stuck in the car or tried to open the car. And I realize those were tactical judgments, but at the end of the day, the outcome was not a good one from my perspective. The guy got punched in the face. You know, he didn't have to happen. So, yeah, there's one more. Well, there's one more after that, right?
Another one.
Yeah. So the last one is our ultimate concern was that she put herself and the complainant in danger as a result of her conduct, particularly when she reached into the car prior to making any genuine effort to communicate with the complainant, who was clearly deaf, and that there were opportunities to make the traffic stop safer, such as parking in front of the complainant, particularly accommodating his deafness, de-escalating or waiting for backup to arrive. So we think that the use of force was precipitated by Officer Wen's actions and likely could have been avoided.
So before we dive into open discussion, I think we'll take the policies one at a time. Can I turn back to we want to give Mami a chance to add any clarification based on her investigation, and then ACPD. Mami, I guess I'll kick it over to you first, and then Albert.
Okay. I'm gonna try not to take too much time, but I have a lot to say about this one. This was probably one of the longest reports that I've written in my time here, and it was like the more I watched, the more I looked at, the more issues I had with how this entire incident happened. But I just want to first preface my comments by saying, like, I cannot underscore enough how unnecessarily unprofessional this interaction was. And frankly, I found that it rose to the level of not just unprofessional, but like degrading behavior overall, just in how this person was treated. And it wasn't one officer. I mean, it was primarily this one officer that we were focusing on, but I'm disappointed that there were actually 7 ACPD officers on the scene and then 1 state trooper, which obviously the state trooper is not within our lens, but just to contribute to the fact that there were so many people on the scene and not one person was able to establish meaningful communication with this person who had a very obvious hearing impairment. And that is really a huge missed opportunity from start to finish. And even in how, you know, the interviews and all of that was handled, like at no point was he even offered ASL interpretation. And I just can't justify that. I think also it's important to set the setting of the fact that not only did he have a hearing impairment, but it's 4 o'clock in the morning and he's a Black male being pulled over. And I think that's relevant, not that I think he was treated in any specific way because of his race or his gender or his hearing impairment. In fact, I wish he had been treated a little bit differently because of his hearing impairment. But I just say that to say, when we're thinking about the overall dynamic here and all of the factors that we take in, you know, considering officer safety and just like how dynamics should be considered and, you know, weighing in things like use of force and whatnot, I think it's also important for officers to have sensitivity around how people may react in these situations, right? In the same way that scholarly articles were cited in the OPR investigation about how officers may be, you know, undergoing acute stress after a physical altercation with someone and may say things that would otherwise be seen as unprofessional, which I definitely agree with. And I totally would look at statements being made in the course of, you know, in a physical altercation with someone in a totally different lens than if that was not the case, because at the end of the day, we're all humans, right? And we should be treated as such. But also, let's also consider that when you pull over someone who has all of these communication inabilities or impairments, or just needs a little bit of additional accommodation to be able to communicate meaningfully, and you're Black and you're visibly terrified. And I mean, I don't think only people of color are scared at traffic stops, right? I'm not limiting it to that, but I'm just speaking to the, you know, the the I don't think it's an elephant in the room, but that, you know, a lot of times people of color have negative experiences with law enforcement historically. And so there are some psychological triggers that happen when a person that may happen, not always, when a person of color is pulled over. And so just taking some of those factors into consideration and being able to distinguish when someone is actively trying to be non-compliant versus they're actually experiencing some sort of trigger or some sort of normal human behavior, and being able to respond in a human way, I think is what is at the heart of all of this. So I think if we had thought about it from that lens or responded from that lens, we may not be having this conversation today. But I think that's a foundation that I wanted to lay for all of the allegations that are involved in this investigation. Um, so starting with duty responsibilities, for me, sustaining that allegation was primarily based on the fact that Officer One, again, I like to underscore also after reviewing all of the footage that in retrospect, I think all of the officers failed to follow the 523 policy on accommodating people with hearing impairments, but focusing specifically on Officer One, it could have been under that policy, but I looked at it as a duty responsibility in the lens of the overall failure to be able to accommodate the hearing impairment and just the overall way in which this person was treated, which, as I said in the beginning, I found to be degrading beyond the level of just unprofessional, but degrading. And so that's why I separate that out from the personal contact piece. Moving to that, I sustain that one as well, specifically for the statement around I punched you in the effing face. I don't find that to be obviously professional, but what I was speaking to earlier in that if that had happened in the middle of a scuffle, that would still be unprofessional, but I think it would be looked at a little bit differently. But in this situation, the officer had multiple times where she was able to cool down, walk away, come back. And at the point that she made that statement, it was absolutely taunting and not in the moment of acute stress. And so I think that deserves a separate, allegation to consider in and of itself. I also wanted to note that I was very concerned with the response in the questioning in the administrative interview as to why she made that statement. The officer's position was that she was trying to validate the person in their feelings, that he was punched and that she was trying to help him because he was trying to, in whatever way he could, verbalize to the other officers that he had been physically, hit. And obviously he wasn't able to verbalize that because of his impairments, but not only does he have a hearing impairment, but he's like kind of nonverbal as well. So he's trying to communicate using gestures and whatever he can verbalize. And so she says, yeah, I punched you square in the effing face. And her explanation was, I was trying to help him see that he was being heard and he wasn't alone. And I was trying to help him communicate to the other officers and validate that he had been punched. Unacceptable, like completely unacceptable. And that I don't understand how that could slide. To me, that is, again, I said in my report, it doesn't holistically present a credibility issue because I think holistically she was honest, almost brutally so, about how she felt about the incident. And even after the fact, she did not feel that her actions would have changed at all, even with additional training. And so I'm not insinuating at all that there's an honesty issue here, but let's not gaslight. Like, let's not say that we're trying to validate someone by saying that. Like that's not okay. That was not validating in any way. And I just like that answer was extremely concerning to me, and it probably caused for some additional conversations around just interpersonal skills or emotional maturity, because that's just not how you validate someone who's experienced this, level of trauma. And it just added to me to the overall, like, in retrospect, now months later when we're interviewing you, I want an officer, any officer, to have some reflection in terms of, how they handle the situation. Here we are months later, and you're saying that you were trying to validate someone by saying, yeah, I punched you square in the effing face. Like, I'm sorry, but no, that we're not doing that. So that was my reason for sustaining the personal contact. Use of force. I also recommended de-escalation, again, for the same reasons that I stated earlier, in that, you know, this was, as Dave said, I think a normal human response to someone who was unable to communicate. And I think that there is obviously like a two-party dynamic here where people are trying to communicate and she's trying to communicate one thing and he's trying to communicate another thing. But especially because of the fact that he has this hearing impairment and I think she's aware of it, I think because there was an underlying duty to try to meaningfully communicate with this person, but specifically as pertains to use of force, a responsibility to try to de-escalate. And there's no reason for me to think that had there just been some meaningful communication established, that this use of force never happens. And so, again, a normal human reaction to someone reaching in their car and trying to open the door, and he has no idea what's happening. When there was an attempt to try to communicate and point and add additional gestures, he did comply. So I didn't view his behavior as non-compliance. It was more so confusion. And so I think reaching in the car to try to open the door was an additional, escalation of that. In her interview, she talks about that when people are pulled over, regardless of whether they speak English or have a hearing impairment or whatever, if you're driving in America, you should know that when you get pulled over, you need to roll the window down and you need to turn the car off or you need to step out of the vehicle and that sort of thing. And, to a certain extent, that may be true. And some of that may be common sense to some people and to others may not. And also maybe that people respond to, trauma or under pressure differently. But especially when you have these additional aspects of, these obvious hearing impairment, in the same way that you have expectations of how people behave. I think what I'm trying to underscore here is that I did not support the position that the expectation of an officer of how citizens should respond to their interaction with a law enforcement officer, which can vary from person to person and can be impacted by impairments or fear or whatever, normal human behavior should override your ability to be able to respond in a normal human way. So, if your mindset is as soon as I pull up, people should know what time it is and they should roll down the window and turn off the car and step out of the vehicle and what have you. And if that doesn't happen, you're not able to respond differently. Like that in and of itself is setting up the problem of, wanting people to respond in a way that is just only responsive to you showing up as law enforcement and not a two-way kind of responsibility, which I think is what the spirit of the policy is in asking officers to first de-escalate and give people an opportunity to respond to your commands before you escalate in force. And the last thing I wanted to say about use of force is I understand, unfortunately, in this country that sometimes use of force applications that we don't view as right or moral or whatever the word is, are legal, right? That's fine. That's not the sole consideration here. In my professional capacity as an auditor, my analysis is never just going to end with whether or not it's legal. It can be legal and still not in our policy, still not follow the guidelines of our policy, still not follow the expectations of our community and how we want officers to interact with community members to keep them and officers safe. And so just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. And it doesn't mean that it follows policy. And there are many instances that we can, I think, cite to where officers were disciplined or their actions were addressed administratively, but they still were, found not guilty or maybe not even charged criminally. Legal analysis does not absolve our responsibility as it pertains to our policy. And so I think we should be looking at it from both lenses and not just one. I have some other issues just pertaining to like the overall procedural aspects, specifically the internal investigation and that sort of thing. But I'll save those comments to the end because I wanted to focus in on the allegations for now, and I think I've already taken up a lot of time, so I'm going to end there.
Thank you. Albert, I'm going to let you weigh in and then we'll contextualize how we're going to drive the discussion.
Sure. I'll get started with this. What I'm hearing from pretty much everyone, COB and Mummy, is there's two common themes here. One is sort of this idea of professionalism that took place during the incident. And the second one is, making an adjustment for the individual once they recognize that they're hearing impaired. And I do see, and I do recognize, and I just want to acknowledge that you guys have talked about it ad nauseum. There was a lack of professionalism that took place certainly towards the end. And there can be accommodations made to an individual who has specific impairments. But the point I want to come across as I go through my points is that that has to be done once the situation is stable. And so there's a lot of conjecture and a lot of discussion about what the officer should have done or could have done instead of the actions that they took, right? And so the way that the ACPD has to look at it is basically say, these are the actions that the officer took. Are they objectively reasonable? Could another officer have made those same decisions based on the facts they were confronted with? So let's talk first about this decision to remove the individual from the car immediately. I think, Dave, you brought that up a couple of times. Why is that decision made? So, and you all talked about it, this belief that this individual was operating the vehicle while being perhaps impaired. That's the officer's belief. It's late in the middle of the night. The car travels and commits several traffic violations, continues to not obey the emergency equipment that's signaling for them to pull over, which are all indicators of potentially a DUI or intoxicated driver. Those of us who have worked midnights understand that that is a common behavior of most DUI drivers. So the officer has this in mind, approaches the vehicle, then, basically tells us and matches up with the video that there's this sort of weighing of the public safety need, right? The public safety risk with the risk of their own personal safety. And I'll get to that in a second. There was a question about, why this officer reached in the car. And so that's where I'm kind of getting at. The officer talks about making a judgment call about why they reached into the car because they felt that there was a overwhelming public safety need. Cannot let the vehicle move down the road. It is standard practice for officers who are doing DUI investigations to have the driver exit the vehicle immediately. The reason is because as long as that driver is seated inside the car, they're in control of a very large vehicle that is unpredictable, right? So it can go careening down the road, it can back up and smash the cruiser, it can do a whole bunch of things. So that is why generally for DUI stops, the actions of the officer are almost immediately to remove the driver and separate them from the vehicle so they don't have the capacity or the ability to move that vehicle again. We talked about, I think, Dave, you brought up the idea of, pulling in front of the car. Like, why didn't the officer pull in front of the car? The reason you don't pull into the front of the car when you're by yourself is because you are putting yourself in even more danger than reaching into the car. Again, the car is not under your control. That's not something that we would do by yourself. You can do that in coordination with several officers who are on scene, but we would never teach, practice, or train an individual officer to pull in front of a vehicle by themselves in the middle of the night. Because once you get hit by a car, you can be knocked unconscious, you can be run over. There are many bad things that can happen if you decide to pull in front of the car by yourself. It's safer to be behind the car for yourself as you approach because this is an unknown situation. We talked about, this immediate recognition for the officer to recognize that the individual was deaf. And, there's been a lot of talk about that and making an accommodation for that. And I will say this, and I'm going to go back to the second theme that I provided before, which is that accommodation can be made once the individual is stable, right? So a DUI driver, someone who's hearing impaired, can still be DUI. Someone who's hearing impaired can still present a lethal or significant threat to the officer. Physical impairments by themselves do not negate threat or a threat to the officer. Okay, so if the officer perceives this threat, we have to look at it, is it objectively reasonable for this officer to believe these things based on the totality of the circumstances that they were confronted with? Um, uh, and then I think we talked, I just want to hit a couple more things. I think there was some discussion about the use of force policy and it requiring two things, which is the least amount of force necessary, which is not a requirement of our use of force policy. It is, you officers are permitted to apply objectively reasonable force. We do not make a requirement for them to apply the least amount of force because that, again, as a subjective thing. The way that we've applied our use of force and the application of force is whether or not it is objectively reasonable. There's been some discussion about de-escalation and trying to de-escalate. So I think what I'm hearing is, and it's okay. It's okay that this has been done, but in this situation, there's a lot of second guessing about the actions of the officer. The officer could have done this. The officer should have done this. The officer should have taken more time to do this. I understand why that's being done, and I think I've mentioned it before. When you watch an incident on video or read about it, you have the ability to stop, rewind, pause, freeze frame, read the specific text on a piece of paper multiple times and conceptualize it and try to digest it. When it's run live, you're not afforded that opportunity. You have to make a split-second decision based on the situation and the facts that you are being confronted with. And so what I would say is when you look at this situation, I understand that we're talking about the officer could have done this, the officer could have done this. And I'm not going to disagree that some of those things may have been done. But what we have to look at is whether or not those decisions that were made as it applies to force, as it applies to those tactical decisions that you all are talking about, are they objectively reasonable? Could a reasonable officer make those same decisions based on the totality of the circumstances that they were confronted with, right? In live time, meaning you only have seconds to figure out what your next action is going to be. You don't have the luxury to pause. You don't have the luxury to freeze frame. You don't have the luxury to second guess yourself because if you are wrong and make a mistake, then there's a lot that's going to go on the line. And so, those are the pieces that I wanted to push out, just, throwing out there. But I recognize that there's a professionalism gap, if you want to say, with this particular incident that we certainly could have handled that a lot better, that the traffic stop certainly could have been handled more professionally, that there were other options. There were other things that the officer may have chosen to do. I recognize that. I'm not going to say that those options were not available. What I'm trying to do is look through the lens of the officer at the time and place of the incident, which is in the middle of the night by themselves with unknown facts. Okay, and then they have to make a split-second decision about what actions they're going to take next. And then with that, okay.
No, just,
Sorry, we can't take public comment in the middle, but we'll make space for public comment. But thank you for doing this. I mean, I think a lack of professionalism is a profound mischaracterization. I think this is outrageous. I certainly want to maintain for our discussion that we can talk about from a policy standpoint what changes would make an officer better equipped to handle a situation in the future. Like Monday night quarterbacking and saying what the officer should or shouldn't have done isn't helpful. And that's not the purpose of our case investigation reviews. That said, it seems to me like every layer of ACPD failed to communicate with this person in a way that would be proper, meaningful understanding. I think that starts with Officer 1. I think it goes on to every other officer on scene who let her keep interacting with him. We've seen in other cases where officers see a breakdown in communication between a member of the public and the person interacting with them and step in. And we've seen that done very well by ACPD officers to say, this situation will be improved by somebody else intervening. I will get to questions. I didn't see any effort on scene to do anything other than communicate with him by text, which wasn't possible for him. He was handed a phone while in handcuffs, which had recently been tightened from behind his back as if he would be able to type a message on the phone, which is just like very difficult for me to sit with. I think my first major issue from the OPR report is the discussion of a DUI. There is no evidence that she was concerned about him being drunk in the footage. We have radio of her talking about why she pulled him over and that she was frustrated that the lights mean you need to stop. We have a conversation that she has with him once he's seated and once the scene is controlled. There was no sobriety test. There was no breathalyzer. She mentions to no one on scene that she suspected he was drunk. And in fact, she tells her officer, her supervising officer, when he arrives that her probable cause was the suspended driver's license. There is no mention on scene or indication that she thought he was drunk. He was driving slowly, but there was no, he was swerving, there was this. So maybe that's a reasonable thing to think in your own head, but it seems very tempting to conclude that that's an after the fact narrative to explain why we go and instead of like we normally do, knocking on a window and waiting to roll the window down, pulling on the car door, getting him out of the vehicle. That he was not stopped in response to the lights. He, just to be clear for the kind of public dialogue, the vehicle came to a stop at a red light. So rolling through one or more stop signs, not pulling over, the driver comes to a complete stop at the red light. There are multiple policies that ACPD is aware of, including one of the other officers who arrives on scene and says to the supervising officer when he arrives, I think we're going to need a blue envelope if you catch my drift, referring to the statewide program that says communicating with people, it's not limited to people with autism, but or other communication difficulties takes more time. That policy explicitly talks about how unnerving flashing lights can be to people who are in that situation. So not to Monday Night Quarterback the officer's actions, but in the OPR report, there's a ton of peer-reviewed research about how jarring it is for an officer to have a physical altercation, and there's no mention of the fact that this deaf man was visibly terrified, that he said stop, that when he was in handcuffs, what he was trying to verbalize to the other officers was help me, and she hit me, and she was allowed to stand there and keep taunting him about, and she then led the vehicle inventory, which I'm curious if that is a standard practice. If I am an officer and I'm involved in a use of force, I would assume that once there was any other officer, let alone 6 and state patrol, that other officers could have taken the lead interacting with him in a much more constructive way. Multiple officers on scene speak to him from behind him saying, the calmer you are, the easier this will go. After everyone on scene has established that he's deaf, and they're not standing in front of him where he could plausibly read lips, like every layer of this interaction is so outrageous to me. And where I come down on the use of force finding, which I think is our most serious discrepancy here, there were no pedestrians, there were no vehicles. Recognizing I work in traffic safety, that a large moving vehicle poses a risk to officers and others, or the person in the vehicle themselves. Once she got him to understand she wanted him to put the vehicle in park, he did. She did not gesture in the body-worn camera footage something that I would take as an indication if I couldn't hear someone to turn off the vehicle. So before she gave him an opportunity to continue complying, she starts pulling him out of the car. And my issue with the use of force here before punching him in the face is that we repeatedly in these conversations talk about how central and prominent de-escalation is in every facet of ACPD's training. And we've heard from your training officers, they do an excellent job, but this was a failure because the policy says that you have an obligation to de-escalate, and all of that training, besides the case law before all of the precedent, is time and space. She was physically advantaged standing above him in a lower vehicle outside the car where she could move away, and she didn't. And then after that, she continued to escalate the tension in the conversation, and nobody else on scene intervened. Nobody else said, okay, you might not be the best person to interact with this, or you've been through enough. why don't you step aside and let somebody else lead the interaction and do the vehicle inventory? Because the other thing that struck me is after she tells her supervising officer that her probable cause was not a DUI, that it was a suspended driver's license, she, after she has that conversation, she's going to do this interview, and she keeps telling people that she's itching for the obstruction charge, that because he didn't pull over, that he was obstructing justice, which again kind of fails to take into account that, which was the charge filed. And maybe that's, kind of a point of protocol where, the officer who pulled them over is who decides what the charges are. But it does not seem like he was disobeying lawful commands. It seems like he was scared, overwhelmed, and unable to understand what was going on and what he should do. Once he understood what he should do, he did, but then every other officer on scene failed to recognize that this deaf person can't text from a handcuffed position on the curb and cannot communicate when you're talking from behind them, and that the entire 20-minute incident goes on with nobody seeming to say, is there somebody we can call for communication support the way that we do when we have non-English speakers? So as we go through the policies, I think what we have is consensus on personal contacts. She shouldn't have cursed. Her professionalism could have been better. That's a sustained policy allegation. For the second piece, the duty responsibilities, recognizing that there is an established policy on communicating with deaf or hard of hearing people, that is my understanding. Part of the recommendation to sustain a violation of duty responsibilities is that there is a policy that wasn't observed. From my perspective, that affects kind of the whole chain here, because to Mummy's point, even in conducting an interview, thinking that somebody who's felt violated or, wrong by their interaction with ACPD, conducting this conversation by text falls short of what I think would be a human standard of saying, you were punched in the face by an officer, we thought you were drunk, your license was suspended, you didn't follow the stop signs, but we recognize that you're a human being and that this was traumatic, and we would like for the rest of your interactions with the ACPD to meet a higher standard of not just professionalism, but humanity, and recognizing that he cannot communicate verbally. And then the last part on use of force, I think it's important that we look at what the de-escalation policy says, which is to use de-escalation. And if we're going to keep revisiting this notion that it is a prominent part of all ACPD training, that is a failure. It doesn't have to be, not all of these incidents need to be then, discipline. The matter of discipline is a separate consideration. But like we found in bias-free policing and previous use of force, if the policy makes it so that it's difficult for ACPD to find a sustained allegation when a policy was violated, because we don't want them to incur, some very negative consequences stipulated by policy, then it's worth revisiting those policies to figure out how we make that, like we've talked about with implicit bias. We have to be able to conclude that it was wrong and illustrate that ACPD acknowledges a need for continuous improvement, and that does not come through in the OPR report. It does not saying that with more training, with more preparation, any reasonable ACPD officer should have been able to react to a deaf driver who was visibly terrified, who was slowly but truly complying with orders, should not have been assaulted in the way that physical interaction unfolded. Not just the punch, but interacting with the vehicle and not giving him proper time to comply. So I think we can go through the policy violations or the allegations one by one. I want to get the COB's other members a chance to ask questions. Charles, I know you're online, so we can't see your face on the current screen, but if you raise your hand, we can hear from you, and then I think we should go through those one by one.
I don't want to add too much in addition to everybody's, I think, kind of covered the details. I just want to say that from my impression of it, looking through the footage and reading kind of the reports, it seemed fairly clear to me that Officer 1 lacked patience a bit of a temper going in, and exercise poor judgment, which are not great things for anybody. It becomes actually dangerous when you're talking with a law enforcement officer. So I think that and the failure to recognize after the fact, having the benefit of time, having the benefit of reflection, saying no additional training wouldn't have had me do anything wrong. There's seemingly nothing I could have done better. Regardless if you think you were within policy or not, that's a little concerning, because the answer for most reasonable people about anything we do should be yes. We could always do better. And I think that that to me was a little disturbing. The last thing I'll say on this, because again, I think that everybody's kind of talked around most of the things I want to talk about, is I want to give just a little bit of shout out that we're talking about this today, I think in no small part, because Complainant One's legal counsel filed this on behalf of him. And from his interactions afterward, when Complainant One was interviewed, like most people that have poor experiences with police departments, he was kind of seemingly done with it and didn't really want to take it up himself. But the fact that we are talking about this, I do appreciate, because I do think it's an important issue for us to have this public discourse so that people can understand from ACPD's view, from IPA's view, COB's view, and actually around, of course, this very serious topic. But that was brought to our attention because his counsel wanted to file this and also reach out to the Commonwealth's attorney about some of the charges. So I appreciate you bringing that to our attention.
Nika, Charles? Yeah. Okay. Before we go into votes, I had a couple of follow-up questions. Maybe we can discuss this secondarily, but are there other resources available to ACPD for interacting in traffic stops for people with different abilities? I can imagine that there are physical impairments similarly that would require a different treatment.
I mean, I think especially at that time of night, you're going to struggle with finding an ASL like a interpreter like at 4 a.m. But there are resources available. Language line, I think there's teletype for people that, or I forgot what it's called, for people that are blind, but there are resources out there specifically as it relates to hearing impaired. I'm not 100% confident. I'm sure that there's something that we could call ECC and ping them. We can always ask for mutual aid from a partner to have them ping the regional agencies, maybe Fairfax, Falls Church, or one of the neighboring jurisdictions to determine if they have an officer that is fluent in American Sign Language. So there's a way that you can do it, but offhand, that's going to require a little bit of effort. That answers your question.
So that's one of the things I think we need to follow up on still, because, waiting an hour for somebody who can sign, that's not really reasonable either. So, language line works well for different languages. I don't know that there's something similar for sign language, but I think it's some of the things, I made a note, that's one of the things some entity or some who we can contract with to FaceTime.
Or software. I mean, even would be better to be able to.
Because we have a lot of officers or staff members that speak different languages, so that, that's easier. I can only think of one or two people in the time I've been here who actually could effectively communicate with signs. So it's a gap area.
Is there a policy related to an officer involved in use of force subsequently communicating with the person they use force against?
No, there's not. If you're asking if there's like a prohibition against that, no, there's no prohibition against that. I mean, that happens on probably a daily basis where, we're at nightlife details, someone needs to get arrested, they're kind of resisting a little bit, they get taken to the ground. The officer that took them to the ground summarily books them for being drunk in public. So that happens probably on a daily basis, and there's no prohibition against that.
The thing that stuck out for me on that was that as she talked to him, she still hadn't realized that he couldn't hear what she was saying, presumably. I mean, so anyway.
Where does the DUI implication first come into evidence? Is that first from the interview with her?
My understanding is that that was the first indication of the DUI evidence, but it matches up with driving behavior and time of day. Like I've worked, I think most of us here, like they're sitting around here, have worked nights or the midnight shift, and those are the indicators of an intoxicated driver. Whether that was articulated that evening, probably there was some lack of focus that was happening during the course of Officer One's interaction with everyone, and so maybe that wasn't specifically articulated.
I can imagine why that it would be maybe impossible to conduct a field sobriety test with somebody who's dead.
Very
A
valid.
breathalyzer is very feasible, and there was no mention of that or movement towards verifying.
Yeah, so breathalyzer, breathalyzer. It's interesting that you say breathalyzer. So you mean so there's the preliminary breath test when that some officers have available to them on scene. That requires a notification about the preliminary breath test, like the card piece that you have to, that you have to read to them. And secondly, that's not something that is typically done outside of field sobriety tests that are beginning. So like an officer is just not going to give a field PBT to someone. They're going to go through the field sobriety test with that individual, then offer the PBT, or option 2 would be to get a search warrant for blood.
So
That's just what I'm saying is like
Yeah.
procedurally, that's not what officers do.
do the officers carry that card with the
Yeah.
notification in writing?
In writing, I believe it's small. Do they still carry the small card? Yeah, it's very small.
So were the.
But it is in writing, yes, the text is there, yeah. But those are the two, I was basically saying, yes, there's that piece which kind of, not makes it impossible, but presents a little bit of an obstacle when you're presenting the PBT. But part 2 is without the field sobriety test, generally speaking, the officer's not gonna offer the PBT. They're just gonna get a search warrant for blood. And the reason is because,
Blood analysis?
no, there was not.
Was any other follow-up on the DUI done?
No, not to my knowledge.
That's tough to swallow. I mean, it's very difficult to feel like the reason for all of this was because she suspected a DUI. No mention of it in her active conversations on the radio where she says he should be pulling over. No mention on scene while she's rattling off what she's upset about to him. Nothing about him being drunk. She says, because that's what all this is for. She shows him something on her phone and she asks and she says, and there's an exchange where she has texted to him that he has a suspended license, which is presumably why she pulled him over. But I mean, we don't have copies of the text messages. I don't even know if she sent them. I think she probably just typed them out on her phone. But she shows him something and says, because that's why we did all of this. And then he gestures no, and she says that that's what it came back in the system. I'll check. Making a very strong implication that what she told him she pulled him over for was a suspended license. So I'm really struggling with the DUI narrative in the OPR report because it seems very retroactively fit to justify the energy she brought directly to the vehicle. What she also said in her interview about on scene about he was hanging out in the neighborhood where a girl was abducted in Alexandria. I'm more sensitive to the notion that if you thought that this person had possibly been involved in a violent crime against a child, but that doesn't come up anywhere else in the conversation. And so I don't want to speculate about her motivations, but I do want to comment that the OPR report does not align the facts that were presented as an analysis that sits cogently with the facts we saw on the body-worn camera footage from every different angle. Nobody on scene says anything about him being drunk. And the only mention is that she tells her officer, and she tells him that her probable cause was his suspended driver's license. So I looked at some of the peer-reviewed literature on, officer activation, you know, in response to a physical altercation. I'm sensitive to the fact that she gets back to her car and she says to herself, you know, he scratched my lip. Yeah, like, I'm sensitive to the fact that she was alone, you know, initially she seems a little bit, I'm going to say, embarrassed that all of these other officers are here, and somebody makes an aside comment to her that says, like, when we heard he was fighting with you, we all showed up. I think that explains why, you know, we've talked in the past about how many officers, an appropriate number of officers, and one of the things on scene is there was, like, I think it's 6 ACPD officers and a state patrol, and that makes sense to me. There's a female officer alone on patrol. She gets into an altercation, everybody shows up, but there's this kind of embarrassment, and that's what bothered me a little bit about the inventory was, you know, she makes these comments like she's itching for this extra charge of obstruction and kind of trying to get some validation that that's reasonable, and it seemed defensive. And I struggle with the DUI narrative because his car was in park. She had control of the situation. She just wasn't spending enough time, and because he's just not listening comment is like haunting my nightmares. I can't imagine that the other officer shows up and his first comment is he deaf? And she says, I don't know. And he says, he's saying he's deaf. And she says, get him out of the car because he's just not listening. That did not seem like, we don't have control over the scene. The car's in park. He's stopped. They have this interaction. It seemed like Officer 2 didn't have enough information to say, I need to intervene to de-escalate, because it had already been escalated by Officer 1. So that's my challenge with use of force is there was no attempt at de-escalation, and there was time and space available to her with no pedestrians, no cars, and a car in park.
That's a quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
This is, I don't want to derail your more substantial points, but this is just something that should have occurred to me earlier. You guys have like a policy in place that, you know, like, it makes sense, right, to reach for like something to text to somebody that is either deaf or hearing impaired to communicate. But if somebody's typing things out and deleting them, those aren't the records that are being kept for those communications. Is there anything that captures those?
I think we have a records retention policy that talks about preserving records that are related to like a criminal investigation, to making sure that it's preserved. I think I actually recently looked at it. So what I'm saying is there probably is. Could I spout it off to you?
Right.
Right out of like
capture that if somebody types something.
So the interesting thing is it's probably in that scenario, I think that you, and you're an attorney, the question would be, if I did not actually show it to the person, is it a record related to the investigation? Right. So is it part of the communication? Right. So I don't know if that would qualify under that piece as part of the criminal investigation. Certainly if I did not show the person as a part of our communication, like us recording the conversation and us talking back and forth one another, that's a record of this event. Me doodling on a piece of paper and then scratching it up or whatever.
Right.
It's essentially the same thing, right?
I essentially agree with you.
Yeah.
To your point, I'm more concerned about you typing something, showing me, and then erasing it and typing.
I got you.
Right?
I got
Because then we just don't have testimony after. I was just wondering.
I think it's also context too, like if it's a conversation specifically about a crime that somebody's being interviewed about, that obviously is a record that has to be maintained. The context could come into it too. I'd have to read the exact language of our record retention specifically. I mean, if it's what's your name, what's your address, I'm not as sure about that. But if it's contextually related to what
Substantive versus biographical.
Yes.
We also don't know how much he was reading those messages. He read at least a couple of them, but he was sometimes kind of turning away. Like he was still.
Well, you couldn't hold it. It was small.
Yes. We don't know
He
how
was
much he got
interacting with
of
somebody
those
who just
messages.
punched him in the face. Yeah, I was gonna say, we can go through one by one then. So the COB co-lead's recommendation for personal contacts is, Charles?
Yes, I didn't know if everyone wanted to go around first before you wanted me to give me time to say something, or I just didn't understand how the process. No, oh, okay, no worries. No, again, our co-leads and the questions that my colleagues have asked covered, I think, the majority of my thoughts. I think I'd just be remiss if I didn't say that I do understand ACPD's concern about this Monday morning quarterback, and they brought it up before. And we do have the luxury of stopping and rewinding video that the officers didn't have. And like I said, I respect that. But respecting the reality of split-second decision-making to me does not mean that we start our analysis at the split second when force was used, and that what happened before that moment matters, because those are the decisions that help create the moment. So I do take a bit of exception with that thought that we're just kind of Monday morning quarterbacking, and because it's been said tonight, it's also been said at other times. As others said, I too, as someone who's here in South Arlington, and we're here in another South Arlington situation again, and as a South Arlingtonian, I just can't keep coming back to that human element. And I just want to bring that forward, that we have a human being in a car. It is 4 a.m. It is a black man alone, unable to hear what is being demanded of him. And it's just as Dave said it, he said it perfectly. It did not look like he was resisting. It didn't. It looked like he was scared to death. And we just have to understand where we are at. We have to understand where we're at. The officers have to understand where we're at. Yes, deafness does not eliminate danger, and perhaps there was a true suspicion of DUI, and if so, that is serious. But the car was in park, and the gestures were producing compliance, and his deafness was known. His inability to communicate, it was known. And as you said, Julie, the failure to accommodate did not make this encounter safer at all. In fact, it helped escalate it. And in my estimation, it really put both officers and the complainant in danger. So for me, we're getting ready to go into the votes on this, and this is why I'm going to support what our co-leads are recommending, because the policies that we look at, they cannot just govern the kind of like the force that an officer ultimately uses. I don't think it's just that simple. It's really about a guide of what gets us to that moment. What gets us to that moment? So when the person in front of you cannot hear, when they can't, when it's obvious there's a communication difficulty, I think it's really incumbent on us as we're doing that analysis that we just are making sure that officer is recognizing the humanity, is adapting as necessary, and trying to bridge that gap. And I think that's really at the heart of when we're looking at policies and determining if an action really was reasonable or not. And I'm not sure if I saw that recognition, that willingness to adapt, and that recognition of humanity.
Thank you, Charles. Are we ready to vote on personal context? Okay, I will hear a motion to adopt the COB's recommendation to sustain the personal context violation. Joshua moves. Any second? Anika seconds. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Charles, that's aye. Great.
It's I thought you could see me on screen. It's not.
Thank you. Okay, that recommendation is adopted. Let's go to duty responsibilities. I'll hear a motion to adopt this co-lead's recommendation to sustain the duty responsibilities violation. Joshua so moves. Second. Anika, all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Everyone's an aye. Use of force. Mummy, do we need to frame this as within policy versus sustained, not within policy?
Yeah, it's technically within policy or not within policy.
Okay. That
Being
was
for
me.
force.
We will hear a motion to adopt the co-lead's recommendation that the use of force was not within policy. Joshua so moves. Anika seconds. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Excellent. Okay. I don't know if you guys have specific recommendations to discuss. Okay. From the discussion, I think I would like, and I'm happy to do some work on this also, because we do a lot of people with different abilities in traffic safety, see if there are software.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Julie, but you're sounding a little bit more muffled, and there's a little bit of an echo that I'm hearing. I don't know about others online, but it became a little bit harder to hear you all when you went back into the last piece of discussion.
You are also muffled.
I say it goes both ways.
Yeah, I-
Okay, so maybe it's me. What you did just now sounded more clear.
Okay. I should have switched to my audio. It's fine. Can you hear me okay though, Mummy? Okay. So one of the things that strikes me is, we do live in an era where technology is helpful in bridging these gaps. I recognize that ACPD is not resourced with infinite capabilities for outreach to other entities. I do suspect that there is likely software that could help with ASL translation. I will happily look into that. I think it's worth looking into just because this was unforeseeable to me. Now that we can see that it takes place, it would be helpful to think about what other resources are available.
We have language line. Yeah.
We have language line. I wrote that down to make sure
Okay.
it's part of our contract because it's important to us. The technology.
Yeah.
I don't know, we have to really spend a lot of time on that, but language line is vetted and
Right.
so,
Right.
I already made a note to see if
When-
that's available to us under our contract, because we do use language line. For language.
Oh,
I just need to make sure it's part of
Yeah.
our contract.
maybe.
Well, and recognizing that software has to be tailored for specific police interactions. I realize that. I'm curious, and maybe based on time, I suspect this is probably a conversation for another time, but it seems to me like, whether you're in Clarendon and it's just like a drunken public and, you're behaving in a way that requires you to be tackled to the ground, there's always going to need to be discretion in how you interact with people physically. And depending on the other officers and the situation at hand, whether or not there's somebody available to intervene. In this instance, it did seem like it would have been very helpful for somebody else to lead communication with this person. And there were six other people there to do so. So it might be worth considering whether, and it would include subjective language that we, probably could argue about in the future, but of after a use of force, when other officers are available, and the scene allows that somebody else take over. Because I think without a policy for that, I can imagine that a bunch of officers responded on scene. They didn't see what happened. They have no idea what's taking place. They're not going to go all get singularly briefed, and they're not going to step on the responding officer's toes. I recognize that there are other situations where that's a very valuable piece of the culture, but considering a policy or a clarification or even a best practice to say, if you have a physical interaction with somebody, even as much as once they start using profanity, I think we've seen that actually in another case where once the subject that you're interacting with starts, behaving in a way that's not respectful, switching out people can be really helpful. So I would like to consider that for a future discussion. And then I would like to note, maybe just for the COB, we talk a lot about, what's constructive and what can we do going forward versus Monday night quarterbacking and, penalizing an officer. And our standard there is, could a qualified officer reasonably have come to the same conclusion and take the same action? For de-escalation, it seems to me like we do kind of keep coming back to the notion of I'm unclear where there would be a threshold that would be visible that a failure to de-escalate then results in a use of force policy violation. And like we've said with bias-free policing, we don't want anyone to get fired for being human. So we have to figure out how to make a policy that's enforceable for not just accountability, but for culture, to say this matters to us and you have to kind of lead with that. It's the middle of night, she's alone. We don't have to go, into that specifically here, but how we apply that in our reviews has to align with policy. And so far, I struggle to see where we would be able to apply that, because you can always say that, like, given the threat, like, there is always a risk to officer safety. And in this instance, to me personally, it does not seem reasonable that, given her physical disposition, she was at risk if she did not step away and try to communicate more slowly. Time and space didn't seem to come in here.
I just wanted, like, just two comments on that is that there is a threshold. Okay, this agency has in the past violated individuals for failing to de-escalate. I know that because it happened under my watch. So I know that occurred. There is a threshold. And then the use of force review process has significant levels of review, right? Sergeant review, lieutenant review, it goes to a captain in the operations section if that's where it occurred, and then it comes back to the deputy chief of that division, and then it gets floated to OPR, who the only person that reviews those use of force reviews is someone who is a controlled tactics certified instructor and was currently a former academy instructor. Okay, so spent many years in training in the training section, was an academy instructor, and that is the only individual who touches our use of force reviews. That individual is the only one who reviews them. And so this is a way of me saying there are multiple officers with many years of experience that are applying their knowledge, their training, their experience to whether or not they believe a reasonable officer faced with the same set of circumstances could have objectively made the same decisions. It's 6 or 7 different layers of different individuals who all are police officers, who all have been involved in use of force incidents. And it does happen. There are times, I want to assure you, that a use of force policy violation occurs because of a failure to de-escalate. So I don't want to get into the specifics of that, but there is a threshold. This is a way of me saying there's a threshold. And I hear what you're saying, which is like, can that be noodled out somewhere? Can we write that down? What is the threshold? It's going to be very difficult, right? Because situationally, every incident or every occurrence is just going to be a little bit different. The officer's training and level of experience and all those different things, all those factors that the court says that we have to examine, all those things apply into objective reasonableness, de-escalation, all those sorts of things. So it's out there. It's, how should I say this? And it is applied to the training and experience of those that review this process.
So
But I think you're part of what you're talking about is I heard particularly the second bullet about, not bullet, your second thought about,
It'll come back.
I'll start talking again and you'll remember.
it's terrible, I apologize.
I will. I guess what I'm thinking, and I don't want to get into the details right now because this is a ad hoc request and I don't expect you to produce, that information. I do want to understand that threshold. I think it would be really helpful for the COB in having these discussions to have more insight there. And I think we should have that conversation publicly, not asking to say, like, let's drag out specific examples, but let's talk about scenarios where that's applied, because it seems squishy and it is subjective, it is circumstance specific. But it was impossible for me to walk away from this and think that it was reasonable to punch that guy in the face. So I think the closer we can come to an understanding of, how this feels and looks like to the community and what the officer kind of situation is, we're better equipped to come to recommendations like, at least she could have been, somebody else could have taken over this interaction. And then the language line, we can kind of look more and talk about what resources and how do we make that visible to officers, because like the Blue Envelope program, one officer on scene seemed to be aware of that, but that got very barely communicated and then no action was taken. And again, I suspect that was largely out of deference to, I wasn't here, I didn't see everything that happened, I'm certainly not going to interject and take over the situation. So, we've got Mummy and Charles.
Charles is.
So Charles, your hand is just still raised. Mummy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think, piggybacking on the comment about Monday morning quarterbacking, for using this football reference, right? Like, what we are doing here is reviewing an incident, and there's no football coach that I could think of that doesn't roll the tape the following day on Monday, win or lose, and look at what their team could have done better to improve for, the upcoming game or the upcoming season. Similarly, like, I don't think we're here to second guess an officer's every tactical decision, where they park their car, or could they have done this or could they have done that. Like, ultimately they have you know, a lot of different resources at their disposal to use, and a lot of what tools they choose to use or how they choose to use how they choose to use those tools is contingent on the circumstances and what that officer perceives the threat level to be. And that's the piece that I don't think we're necessarily here to second guess, or we shouldn't be approaching it from the lens of, we're second guessing it, unless there's just a situation, which we've seen some, and those are pretty apparent, where how they reacted to a situation just did not at all align with whatever the underlying situation was objectively. Um, but I think what we should be looking at is, we should be Monday morning quarterbacking, or whatever it is you want to call it. Monday morning, looking at the tape, right? That's what we're here to do. But the lens should be, what should we be doing better, not from the sake of holding a specific officer accountable from a disciplinary lens or a judgment lens or what have you. But I think, what could we be doing better? And to me, that's not just about the individual officer's conduct, but also, like, how are we applying policy? How are we being transparent with the public? How are we holding the department in general accountable to enforcing their policies? Was the investigation thorough? Like, all of these things factor into the discussion that we're having. But anytime we're looking at an individual officer's complaint and looking at footage, like, it should always be with the lens of, what have we learned from this and what can we be doing better, and not from, individually picking apart every single action. Unfortunately, when you are looking at a use of force review, you are going to have to get a little bit more fact specific and look at the things. But I think, like, as Charles said, like, the totality of the circumstances matters. And if we were even if this officer had actually meaningfully tried to communicate with this person and then they were non-compliant, that would be a different analysis. If we were just looking at the incident from the lens of when the officer reached in the car to open the door and then the complainant grabbed her arm to push her arm out of the vehicle, or like to push her out of the window, that would be another conversation that's different, because obviously when someone makes physical contact, then there's, that automatically elevates the force. But you can't just look at it in the vacuum of that particular moment. Like, that's not the standard. And so I think, like, what it boils down to in this instance is not, the technicality of, like, how the force escalated, or like, was it reasonable for an officer to punch someone who had grabbed her hand, but rather, was it reasonable for an officer to interpret these actions as non-compliant when you see that someone has a hearing impairment? Did they make any sort of reasonable adjustment to their action to try to get that person to understand? Like, if you just walk up to someone and start talking to them and they can't understand what you're saying, he had no idea why he was being stopped. He had no idea that she suspected him of a DUI or any of these things. So just from that totality of the circumstances lens, I think that's what we're really leaning on here. So anyways, I think that's a good segue into talking about training recommendations, which I want to make sure that we segue into that conversation. And then also there needs to be a conversation and vote on the sufficiency of the discipline. So I just wanted to put that out there as a reminder. If we're segueing into training recommendations first, since I already am off mute, I'll just say that, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't think that there were any real attempts here to communicate with this person. I noted that Officer Six, I think, attempted at one point to grab his phone to try to text. And actually, to Officer One's credit, there were times where she was like, well, maybe we can do this or maybe we can do that, but it just didn't come to fruition because of, I think the underlying tension in the situation where like she tried to get him up to take him out of the handcuffs and then he's still resisting or what she's interpreting as resistance. And so she's like, never mind, we're not going to do that. But at one point, after the incident has like, gone on for a bit and maybe every time, we've had a chance to cool down, she says to Officer Six, for example, you can try to text with him and let him know that if we pull him out of the handcuffs, to text back, like he'll need to just not move around because that's the reason why we did it in the first place. And maybe you can explain that to him. He starts texting and then he's like, never mind, I'm not doing that. Because I already told him that we're going to jail. Like the number of times that all of the officers continue to verbally try to communicate with him, knowing that he was hearing impaired, was mind-boggling to me. And then even when there were opportunities to text, that didn't happen. So then even at the end of the incident, you have someone who is now being put in handcuffs, searched, put in a vehicle to be transported and still has no idea what's really going on. And I just can imagine how scary that is to someone. So I think overall, not just with this one specific officer, I know we have a policy that speaks to this, but it seems that there is a need for more department-wide sensitivity training around hearing impairments. Even the officer who mentioned the blue envelope, it was kind of like in jest or joking. Like I didn't see the compassion or the level of empathy that I would want to see from someone understanding that someone has a hearing impairment and how exponentially scarier that would make this entire interaction for that person. That was lacking across the board. And so I would recommend department-wide sensitivity training on that, like to reinforce this policy. Just because the policy is there in writing does not mean that these officers have absorbed it. There's nothing that indicated to me that they have actually internalized like why this policy is there and how that should change their actions and interaction with people who have whether it's a visual impairment, a hearing impairment, a language impairment, whatever it may be. Like we have tools at our disposal. Wasn't just an issue of like, could technology be improved? Sure, but this wasn't an issue of just technology. This was an issue of lacking human empathy. Secondly, in my report, I talked a little bit about the duty to intervene and to de-escalate. Like, I don't think that this is articulated word for word in policy. I think the spirit of it is there, but if there are 7 other officers on scene and we know one officer has just gotten into a physical altercation with this person, there's absolutely no reason why that person needs to continue to communicate with that person. Like, you've briefed the other officers on what's happened. There was a supervisor, her supervisor on the scene, so many other people that could have interjected and stepped in. And I think taken at least that moment to change the course of the interaction. And what you see more so is people kind of just hanging back and just letting that continue to go on. I recommended that we interview the other officers on scene, not from the perspective of their culpability in terms of any allegations, but I wanted to understand how they perceived the incident and what kept them from stepping in. Is it a lack of empowerment? Is it a lack of clear policy? Is it a lack of training? Is it a lack of, you didn't see that this interaction was going well? Like, what was the obstacle so that we can address that in either training or policy? Because I don't know that it's a training. I don't know that it's a policy issue or a training issue without more information as to like what kept them from doing it. But I know that there were so many other people on the scene that could have stepped in and that it's possible this interaction could have gone a little bit differently, even though as I said earlier, I'm not 100% confident about that because nobody else was really trying to communicate with him effectively, but I'm not sure if that was because that was the tone that was already being set. But at the very least, I don't think any of them would have had a reason to use profanity or have already that, whatever dynamic was going on that led to that statement being made. So I just wanted to underscore those 2 things as I think training or policy recommendations that should come out of this.
Okay, I think we will look at the discipline, and I don't think we need to vote on our recommendation. I think we can do that in the report compilation. but we do need to vote on discipline sufficiency. Mummy, you noted in your report that the discipline for the supervising officer was missing. Is that right?
Yes. So as it pertains to this investigation, you would just be voting on the sufficiency of the discipline for Officer One. But I was going to save this comment to the end, but I'll just address it now. So the supervising officer, even though he was on the scene, failed to actually do a use of force review, which is their responsibility anytime use of force is applied by one of the officers that reports to them. So retroactively, the supervisor went and did a use of force review once we got this complaint and realized that a use of force review wasn't done. The issue is that the investigation related to the supervising officer was treated as an internal investigation. By ordinance, for reasons I don't know or agree with, we do not have access to internal investigations, and we don't investigate those. I only get a report of those after they're completed in like a kind of summary fashion, but I don't have access to the actual investigation that took place related to the supervising officer or any other internal investigation. And so because it's looped into that bracket, one, I want to say we can't speak to the thoroughness of that part of the investigation. We don't know what the discipline was and whether or not it was sufficient in that case. But the bigger issue here is that I want to make sure we outline a caveat. Obviously, I think we should be investigating internal investigations. Those are usually, where you are going to see, from my experience in civilian oversight, the most serious kind of issues related to police department, police culture, whatever is going on within the police department, or at least it informs your, overall lens. So that absolutely needs to be addressed. But specifically, if that is going to be the continued position that the county takes, that we will only look at public complaints, anything that comes out of a public complaint related to additional allegations, whether it's related to the officer in question or other officers, needs to be still grouped into the public complaint category in order for us to have full access. Like if it's roped off, then we don't have access to that. So either it's roped off and we get access to that investigation, or it has to stay in the public complaint realm. But it can't be that it's roped off and we don't have access to it, because my concern is that this I requested a report from OPR, just like a summary at the very least, if we couldn't get access to the record of what happened there. And it's my understanding that the use of force allegation against the supervisor for failing to do the review was sustained. But in the interview, the supervisory officer says he didn't think that a use of force review was necessary. Help me understand why, if an officer tells you I just punched someone, you don't think a use of force review is necessary. But that information is unknown to me or any of us because we don't have access to that report. So knowing that answer, I'd be able to say, okay, well, maybe this supervisor needs to have a supervisory review done. Should this person continue to supervise? I don't know. Based on one incident alone, that's not necessarily a recommendation that I would make. But if this has, any sort of indication of a pattern, or if that, is the question, was a supervising officer aware of his responsibilities and just, didn't do them? Or was he unaware and there's some training or additional, kind of learning opportunities that I can't weigh in one way or another because I don't have the full information as to like what happened there. And then, yes, I don't have information as to what the discipline was there to weigh in on the sufficiency of the discipline. And so that's a very long-winded answer, but to say like it's a lack of insight here, or just an obstacle for us to have full insight in this specific investigation. But overall, I think this highlights the need for us to make sure that we maintain full access to any sort of investigation that arises out of a public complaint. So that procedure needs to be addressed.
Thank you. So we won't vote on, we won't consider, because it's not part of what we have access to, the sufficiency of discipline for the supervisory officer. For Officer One, the finding was a kind of first level discipline shift level counseling with a contact card. One of the things noted was, for members of the public, there's a matrix, there's a protocol, there's like, you don't just decide what the discipline is based on, a whim. There's a matrix by, policy, different types of policy violation, first, second, third offenses, and also comparable discipline issued in other cases. So I think one of the things that stuck out in this was that, not that many years ago, a different officer, gave the middle finger as a joke and was given a suspension. So my understanding is that our recommended finding is that discipline was insufficient. Is that right?
We didn't have to.
Okay.
We did.
Okay. Well, then we'll hold and we'll do that vote at the beginning of it. Okay. Just in the interest of time, I think we're going to move to public comment. We have two members of the public with us.
Sorry, just to close this out. So we voted on the allegations. As far as training recommendations, or is there any discussion related to that is going to be included in the report? Or because I do think we decided that any training recommendations that are going to be officially adopted in the report would ultimately be voted on. So I don't know if you want to open the floor for any discussions around that and maybe then vote on that and the sufficiency of the discipline at the top of the next meeting so that you have a clear record of what to put into the report. Or at least that would be my recommendation just in terms of how to organize the discussion and make sure we don't leave anything out.
Because we have a couple of different recommendations, including a possible policy recommendation about use of interactions following the use of force, I think we'll put that at the top of the next discussion so the COB can see what those recommendations are in writing and feel like they've got time to absorb, only because a lot of that came out of tonight's discussion and I don't want to force a vote when we're still kind of absorbing.
Gotcha. So you'll put them in writing, send them out, and then discuss them at the next meeting, vote, and then vote on sufficiency of the discipline as well?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
And
Thank
those
you.
recommendations from Mummy was department-wide sensitivity training. You and I overlapped in our discussion about like consideration of whether there's a duty to intervene or a policy that could even subjectively encourage that after use of force or some profane kind of degradation and communication that if available, another officer would lead investigations, and then also the kind of software and things like that. So we've got a couple of things to follow up on. We'll vote on those at the top of the next meeting. We have two members of the public with us here in person. We still have several folks online and hands raised. I'm going to welcome you since you seem to want to make a comment. I'll tell you that we have 2 minutes for public comment.
Oh, hi. I'm just a citizen. I'm not sure exactly who the person is. I'm trying to find it online, but one of the things I mentioned, people have said online and different things is that if you're scared to do your job, then you have to do them in different professions. Because if you're scared to like go out and be a good citizen, a good officer that public servant that you are, and you should have standards to that. But if you're signed on any chance, email 4 a.m. early in the morning, there's a lot of different like complications to that. I mean, but in general, rule of thumb is if you're scared to do your job, then you should not the job for you.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time coming to the meeting and coming to kind of weigh in. A lot of what we've talked about in many of our cases is kind of making space to represent 3 very different perspectives. The officers who are equipped and trained, but also put in high-risk situations, the community who interacts with law enforcement in lots of different situations, and then kind of our collective hindsight view and how this sits with all of us. And so certainly the balance of consideration for officer safety, community safety, both affect that public trust. And this body's mission and kind of charge from the ordinance is to increase trust between members of the public and law enforcement. And so that kind of ongoing friction that we have with this sense of fear for officer safety, being a squishy mechanism to justify lots of different behavior under different circumstances is certainly, kind of common theme and a recurring topic of exploration of how can we constructively use the situations we run into as examples to find opportunities and figure out how do we make, um, we're still blurry on the mic. I'm probably speaking away from it, but we do try to use these, bad outcomes in individual situations to inform a broader discussion about what we can do better in the future and how we can look at policies and accountability, including discipline, as a mechanism for encouraging that there be that, notion of, I think it was Mummy, talking about compassion. So we appreciate your comment and participation in the meeting.
Just want to add one more thing to that. And I thought the rule of procedure is, especially at nighttime, that there's always got to be 2 officers on scene, and the on the first stop. So, I mean, I know that might not be like the standard, but like that should be a standard where if it's at nighttime, it should be at least 2 officers on scene. Especially if you're feeling scared to approach the vehicle, then you should definitely have another officer there just to have a sense of like, I have a situation under control.
Thank you. Did you have comments you wanted to share with us? I just want to
Yes.
visit the people in the room first. Yeah, please. I'm gonna time you.
So my first impression, my first question is this, and maybe this can't be answered here. What are the constitutional issues regarding search or reaching into a car? I would think there's kind of like a constitutional sort of membrane around the car, but through which an officer cannot reach without some probable cause. And I would think that even if the operator of the vehicle is suspected of DUI, I don't know if that pierces that constitutional protection.
Yeah, I don't think we can go into that
Can't go into that
this
one.
evening, but
So my next question is what is happening with Officer 1? Is there mediation, dismissal? What's the totality of the officer's job performance? How would this be evaluated as a scenario at the police academy? So to use the football metaphor, the quarterbacking, Monday quarterbacking. So in football or sports, you'd be running drills until it's, until it's impossible to get it wrong. You drill until you get it right, but professionals drill until they can't get it wrong. So I wonder is if the officer is retained, is the remediation sort of the drilling and redrilling the scenarios. And I have a lot of experience. I did this community police academy, and I did 5 minutes behind the badge. And, these drills seem to be, something that should be part of the academy training, full academy training. I do have a question like, what is the right way to behave at a traffic stop? So I would not roll down my window. And I'm not sure if I was an officer, I would want the window rolled down. Because I feel like in the worst case scenario I can think of, the glass is alters the trajectory of a bullet and attenuates the velocity of it. So I don't know, should I roll down my window at a traffic stop? I mean,
so
that would actually be the last thing I do.
I have to cut you off for time, unfortunately. And what I should have said at the beginning of this is we can't necessarily address, and we certainly can't expect ACPD to respond to all the public comments, but what we will do is note the comments and give ACPD an opportunity to respond with us in our comments for our next meeting.
Okay, sure. All right.
Ethan, do you want to call in folks from the web?
Sure, we have one hand raised. Ms. Evans, you can feel free to come off mute and ask your question.
Thank you. This comment has not been made before. The officer stated that anyone who's been driving in the United States is expected to know that they're supposed to roll down their window, turn off the motor, and get out of the car. And I've been driving in the United States for more than 50 years, and I did not know that. Certainly, I've never been asked to get out of the car or gotten out of the car at a traffic stop. I'm not sure I knew that you're supposed to turn off your engine, although I certainly will now. Usually, after you get stopped, you roll down the window and you start fumbling for your driver's license and trying to think, what did I just do that that got me stopped? If that is the expectation of ACPD, you need to let the community know that they're expected to get out of the car, because that is not my understanding. And if it's not the expectation of ACPD, then you need to let your officers know that that is not something that people understand or can be expected of them. Thank you.
Thank you. We have other members of the public online. Anyone's welcome to come off mute. We have a 2-minute time limit for individual speakers. We'll wait a moment before we proceed. I don't see any other hands raised. Ethan, did we have any other requests?
Yep, we
Taylor?
Hi, can you all hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to point out two things. One of the things, I know that there was some mention about kind of things like language line that could be used for specifically deaf people, where there is kind of like an ASL interpreter there. I have personally had experiences with those in the deaf community where they actually have community aids or communication aids that are already installed on their phones, um, in the form of basically whenever you make a phone call to that person, whenever they answer the phone, there is an ASL interpreter on their screen. It's used exactly like language line is. I'm not entirely sure exactly what that is called, or if there is something like an app that can be installed like that. But I certainly think in this kind of situation, if the complainant had their phone on them, that could have easily been, I think, used. Um, One of the other things that I would also just like to point out, I know that there was some mention about a possible DUI. At least in what we heard tonight, I did not hear anything about alcohol on the breath, bloodshot eyes, pinpoint pupils, anything like that. There was only the driving behavior that was mentioned beforehand. Um, and so I just think that the officer, I think this was mentioned a few times, that kind of the possible DUI aspect was kind of an afterthought almost. And so I think without there being anything else other than that driving behavior, that just stuck out as kind of an issue to me.
Thank you. Just for the facts on the record, I don't think we mentioned this. There was a comment made about him sweating. And again, in the context of what we've talked about with the blue envelope and kind of registering, that there are lots of reasons people, can be that way. But I've captured the public comments so far. If we have any other input, we can make sure to address these before our next meeting.
Hi, this is Tia. I just wanted to highlight what Mommy said earlier about that cultural and sensitivity training. I've raised this at several forums and different times we've had communications with the police, and I just wonder what efforts have been made and what progress has been made to get something developed, because it seemingly happens to our Black people more so than anyone. I'm a lifetime second, third generation Arlingtonian, and I'm raising Black children. So I'd just like to know that they're safe and that I'm safe and our people are safe. And I've raised it so many times, and I'm here to work as an ally, not against, not to, knock and ping them, but we have to do better. Efforts have to be made to get these things addressed. We cannot keep having these conversations and saying, oh, well, what about this? And this wasn't that. I even said it last week at the anniversary, 5th anniversary dinner. How about have some conversations with the community? And I suggested specifically the youth and young adults, but have some, besides these coffees or whatever, have some actual town halls or whatever, and actually listen to the people, because we deserve better. And this is my hometown, and I like to see better. But again, I'm here to work with, not against. But that's something that's very important to me, because it's getting out of control. And if you have in 2026, you don't have enough emotional intelligence to determine just by seeing certain things, then maybe you should reconsider that job, that career. And again, not knocking, not pinging, but we can't keep bringing these biases in and not getting them addressed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Anybody else online? Otherwise, I think, Mummy, your updates are next on the agenda, or well, both of ours. Do you have?
Do you want me to start or you want to go ahead first?
No, no, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to everyone who gave public comment. As Julie said, we, in the interest of time, can't respond to every single one, but I plus one everything that you all have raised, and I think leaves us with a lot to respond to, whether it's at the next meeting or in these continued policy conversations. But we appreciate you being here and providing your input. Um, for my report, one thing I wanted to say related to this investigation was my second procedural comment, but I, instead of continuing the conversation there, just moved it over to the report. In reviewing the evidence related to this investigation, just continue to highlight an ongoing issue that we have in terms of access to records. I've been asking for unfettered access since I started here, meaning the ability to see a full file, the same file that OPR or ACPD is able to see when we access Axon. But that has not come to fruition as of yet. It's still ongoing conversation, which is fine, but it's the impact of that issue is something that I want to continue to highlight, because in this investigation, when to kind of explain the issue more vividly, when a when an incident happens, right, ATPD will then take pieces of, or will take the file, and then there'll be some redaction of certain body worn camera footage or incident reports or what have you, to redact it of any sort of personally identifiable information based on, law and that sort of thing. What can happen then, I'm not in any way trying to infer that this is done intentionally, but just rather like human error, which is perfectly normal when there's a separate process of having to take the files from one file, which is the file that they have access to, and then create a separate file that then me and the COB have access to. So what happens in practice is then, first of all, I have no way of telling whether or not I have access to everything that's in that file. So I'm having to piece together what I think should be there. And in this instance, even as I was working on finalizing my report up until the last minute, I'm seeing other people in the background or reading a report and then seeing a name related to an officer that I don't have any footage for. And so up until the last minute, as recently as Monday, I'm having to continue to send you all like more updates of, oh, by the way, this officer is involved and now we have footage for that person. And so one, I want to apologize for that, because I think a lot of the information was coming in last minute, and then also like having to, wait for ACPD to go through the process of redacting that footage. And I will say, like, whenever I flag, oh, I'm missing so-and-so, Captain Kim does whatever he can to get that information to me as quickly as possible. But the issue is that I don't know what I'm missing if I don't know what's there. And so that can cause a delay, one, in me finishing my report, and then you all having an opportunity to meaningfully review information leading up to the meeting. But my other concern is I don't know what other information could possibly be in there that, maybe would have been relevant or that I could have, looked at and considered. And so I can never completely say with certainty that I've looked at everything in a file if I don't know what's in the file and there isn't even like an inventory list. And so I think we need to continue to refine that process. And I just want to continue to underscore the need for us to have full access to files, or at the very least for me to have like CJIS certification so I can see the file in its entirety, and then I can make sure that you all have access to all of the redacted footage or what have you that you need to do your part in the investigation. But there are so many officers involved here, and I wouldn't have even known who was who. I think it also gets confusing to know who is who when you don't know, you don't have like an inventory list or like a key to be able to know what you're supposed to have access to and what's there and what's not there. So that was just another procedural issue that I wanted to highlight and continue to highlight as something that we need to address overall as a civilian oversight agency. That being said, I also wanted to highlight that at our next COB meeting, we are going to have CNA come and do a report out related to the traffic stop data analysis project that was commissioned, I think, about a year ago by the county board. And for members of the public who are not familiar with that, basically we had a consulting agency do a data analysis on traffic stops in Arlington to with the specific lens of looking for any sort of disparities in how people are being treated at during their interactions at traffic stops, and whether there's any disparities as it pertains to any sort of like race, gender, you know, beat, neighborhood, those sort of things. Keeping in mind that it's a quantitative analysis at this level, so it doesn't contain any qualitative data. But I just wanted to flag that that's what we are planning to do at the next meeting. I will let those experts weigh in on exactly what they did, and then obviously we'll have some comments about you know, our interpretation of the data and how it informs our views on traffic stops in Arlington. But also we are planning to post the report on our website publicly so that people in the community have an opportunity to review it prior to the meeting. And then Ethan and I are also working on just trying to condense it into, you know, 1 to 2 page kind of summary that is, I think, more digestible for members of the community, or even, you know, us on this call to be able to just like quickly point to some of the key takeaways from the study. It's just because I want people to be able to ask questions from the most informed lens as possible. And it's a very long, kind of dense report. So we're going to try to see what we can do to kind of synthesize it and just make it more readable to others. But once that information is available, we will push it out on our listserv. If you're not already signed up for it, please do sign up for it. And we'll also post it on the website for folks to look at. The other thing I wanted to just highlight was our 5-year anniversary event that we had on the 5th of this month. You know, we have hit 5 years, and it's gone by really fast. 4 years for me on the job, but 5 years since civilian oversight was created in Arlington. I think that is a huge thing to celebrate. You know, obviously we still have a lot of things that we want to accomplish and a long way to go in terms of getting it to the full sustainability and the full function and the tools that I believe that our oversight agency needs to have meaningful impact. But I think that we have done a lot of work to create the kind of foundation. And during the 5-year anniversary event, we got a lot of feedback from community that like a lot of people are saying, we didn't know you all existed. And, you know, we would like to see you all more in the community. And I just wanted to, and I think we spent a lot of time also talking to people about like what sort of work goes into just creating and just, you know, building the foundation brick by brick. But I want to underscore that like community engagement has and continues to be a priority for us. You know, we have faced obstacles at times, whether it's related to budget constraints, staffing constraints, or just like priorities that were pushed to us related to like focusing on investigations and not community engagement. But it's a new day and we are pushing forward. And this particular summer, I just wanted to say that we like really pushed community engagement. Like this was like the summer of really being outside is what I called it. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank and acknowledge Ethan as well as our interns for helping us actually execute that. But it was a priority for us with our interns that we had this summer to outline events that we could take part in during the summer, and then also create some mechanisms for community to give us feedback on the impact of our engagement, and also to create like a regularly occurring community engagement schedule. So I think we're on our way, but some of the things that we did this summer, just to recap, was tabling at the Blues Festival, at the county fair. Obviously, we had our 5-year anniversary event. We participated in civic association meeting. So a lot of different things that we tried to just kind of implement. Obviously, you know, we have tremendous time constraints with all of the things that we have going on with pushing legislation, reworking our MOU, working on these investigations, working on the critical incident, a lot of different things like that. But it is and continues to be a priority for us to be out in the community, engaging with people and getting their input on these policing issues or how we can better serve the community as a civilian oversight agency. So I wanted to just highlight those things and just reiterate our commitment to that and our desire to continue to build on that commitment. I think that's it for me in terms of my report out. And Charles, I see that you have your hand raised. Is a question for me or comment? You're on
It's
mute.
a comment outside of you. It's just
Okay.
something that.
Okay. I'm done if you want to go ahead.
Oh, it can wait till the end if there's other reports out.
I have just a very small update. We did also renew our temporary support contractor. Rachel Slywick is going to keep supporting us not just on catching up on our reports, but also in some other administrative areas. Thank you very much to the county board for our slightly expanded budget. Notes on that at a different time. Mummy, did you have an update on the timeline for posting a requisition for the new hire?
I'm still working with the county to create the position because I didn't officially go over to the county board until last week on the 11th. So that had to take place first in order for us to create the requisition. It's a little bit of a different process than when I was reporting to the county manager. But we have or you're talking about the deputy auditor position. We have the job description worked up. So we're just creating the position and classifying it internally before it gets posted. It should be posted soon, and I'll make sure to let you all know once it's posted.
I was going to say, while we have more community members, both in the room and online, I wanted to echo that we will be hiring for a deputy independent policing auditor later this year, and we also have a non-member vacancy on our board, which requires qualifying law enforcement experience. But if you know somebody that you think is qualifying or you're interested, you can email us to explore those opportunities. That's all I have. We will do, I'm going to do open discussion before we do meeting minutes, Charles, just so you can jump in.
Oh, now?
Yeah.
Okay. So pardon me, Madam Chair, I know that you said we don't routinely, it's not our policy to respond to comments, but something is on my heart. When I hear people who have been in this county decades saying, can someone please tell me how I should act when I drive? When I have a mother asking, what should my children do to make sure their rights aren't violated? I just want to make this abundantly clear. Rights that depend on good behavior are not rights, okay? A right is not a prize we receive for being agreeable, obedient, respectful, or easy to defend. It does not become more sacred when exercised by someone we admire, nor does it become less sacred when claimed by someone we dislike or doesn't listen. This is the point of a right. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. There may be consequences for what we do. Accountability does matter. Laws matter. The rights of other people matter. But consequences and accountability are not the same thing as treating a person outside of the protection of their fundamental rights. And I just want our citizens to understand that. I want our police department to understand that. That's it. It was on my heart. It was just on my heart.
Thank you, Charles. I think reviewing this case and all the evidence brought up a lot of sentiment of disappointment and outrage. I think hearing from the community is a really valuable part of this, and we always welcome public comment. We have a lot of meaningful work to do ourselves as the COB and working with ACPD, to Mummy's point about the 5-year anniversary event. I think what made it a huge success from my view wasn't that we had, full tables full of people enjoying good free food. That's, to me a bare minimum, but that we had members of the community, including Tia, join us and give us candid feedback and talk to us about, what's most useful, and that kind of open dialogue, the receptiveness to critical feedback is something that we can all work on together, because it is our humanity and it is our rights, but it's translated through our ability to understand each other. So it is not my favorite thing that we can't address all comments, but one, it's not, I think there are some factual elements and questions that require more kind of input, but separate from that, acknowledging the kind of underlying humanity is certainly within our prerogative, and I really appreciate you making time and space to do so. That's, I presume, what brings us all to the table, all parties to the MOU and all of our members of the public, so we appreciate that. Selena?
I have two very pedestrian points to present, Charles.
I always feel that way when I tell the
Eloquent,
Charles.
but I wanted to second what Mummy said, that it was challenging to review this case because it felt like evidence kept trickling in and kept trying to see if we had everything we needed. So if we could do that, that would be great. I also wanted to raise the point about flock, because we have a memo that the interns developed, and it's been in the newspaper like every single day this week. And we just want to put together like a list of questions and some evidence and just have a discussion about flock, because I think it's a huge issue, and it's an issue in Arlington. Like, there's people standing on the roads apparently in Arlington with signs about flock. So I will volunteer. Like, I would like to work on this because I think it's an important issue, and I don't want us to delay it too long, because this is the time that people are talking about it and they have questions, and
Sure.
I would like us to.
I had done a preliminary review because I think, what they put together was mostly to inform us about what flock is and those things, I think, for our meeting prep. I would love for you to take the lead, and I would love to help, because I did a preliminary, it came up in my book club. Like, it is very top of conversation across the country and locally. I suspect it's feasible that we could do CNA and flock in the next meeting, since we're not going to do a case review. But let me just check on that administratively, and then we can.
And anyone else
make
who wants
corrections.
to
Yeah,
get
yeah.
involved, I would be happy.
Yeah. Okay, we will tentatively slate that for the second half of the next meeting, and just confirm before we get our agenda out. Thank you. I completely agree. It's very timely and it's complicated, but it's worth an open discussion, and digging into. Mika, Joshua? Okay. Then our last agenda item is to approve the meeting minutes. Did anyone have questions or feedback? Do I hear a motion to approve the June meeting minutes?
I'll move.
If so moves, Selena seconds. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Okay, wonderful. That adjourns our agenda for this evening. Thank you, everyone online, for joining us in person. We do really appreciate your time coming. You're welcome anytime. We will always have